Now, if you followed any of the press around this film, you probably have certain expectations around it. This film seems to have had negative press for at least 4 straight years, from the casting of Rachel Zegler to the whole dwarves controversy, and even now the movie is being review bombed on IMDb. But when you strip away all the behind the scenes fluff and all the drama, now having seen the film, it's interesting to see what the real problem is. Now, it's very easy to dunk on live action remakes. They're often lazy and often much worse than the original. But what makes this one even more interesting to me is that if there's any film in Disney's back catalogue that they were going to remake, Snow White is the one that I thought had the most potential. See, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was the first feature-length animated film that Disney ever did. It came out in 1937. And yes, it's a classic, it's one we all grew up with, but it came out in 1937 and it's very much a film of its era, which means that there are a lot of parts of it where if you were to just do a straight retelling of it, they wouldn't work for a modern audience. I mean, the prince shows up at the start, he disappears for the entire middle section of the film, and then he shows up at the very end to save Snow White. And I know there will be Disney purists who will go, if that's how the film was, that's how it should be. But if you're going to remake a film, I don't think you should have to bring the flaws of the original with you. The fact there are flaws with the original are what make it interesting and potentially worth redoing. The biggest flaw of the original is that Snow White herself is a pretty flat character. She really doesn't have a huge amount of personality, or there isn't really much character growth for her over the course of the original film. So the opportunity for me was for them to fully round out this character, to do something interesting with her. And they do give her more depth in this film, but they don't give her any growth. So the movie starts with Snow White basically living in servitude under the evil queen, and she's definitely a much more active, forceful character. She definitely stands up for herself a lot more, she definitely feels like she has more of a personality. But the one thing they don't seem to want to change is the fact that Snow White is absolutely flawless. Right from the get-go, she's always doing the morally correct decision. She's standing up for herself, she's standing up for others, and that kind of leaves her nowhere to go as a character. Obviously, as the movie keeps going, there are obstacles and challenges, but there's never a point where you really feel like she grows as a person. She never really has to make a big choice, and so they gave her more depth and made her a more interesting character, but she's kind of exactly the same person at the start of this movie as she is at the very end of it. And it's really weird because the major song that tells us about how she's thinking and feeling is called Waiting on a Wish. It plays very early in the film, and it's about Snow White wondering if she can be the person that she's always wanted to be. Can she take charge of her own life? Can she live up to the ideals of her father? Or is she just gonna wait on a wish? Is she gonna wait for something to happen to her? And it ends up feeling really weird because, you know, the song presents that the arc and growth of her character is going to be someone who is being totally obedient and hasn't taken charge, to someone who manages to be more in control of their own life and stand up for herself. But she's already standing up for herself right from the beginning. So they set up an arc, they don't really follow it in the way they've set it up, and then they don't give her any other sort of change or character growth. It's fine for the song to say she's thinking and feeling this way, but that's never the impression you get from how she acts in the movie. And I want to be clear, this is a writing issue. Like, Rachel Zegler, I think, is fantastic in the movie. I think she was great casting for Snow White, and she really is the best part of it, but the character does become kind of grating because there's just so little to invest in. And so that just left me looking at every other character, hoping for something to latch onto, and just finding nothing. Gal Gadot plays the evil queen. That should be a really fun part, a really fun character in the movie, but she's just not very compelling in it. I really wish they got someone like Cate Blanchett or something to take on this part and really get their teeth sunk into it. The prince has been replaced with a Robin Hood type character. He's got a much more prominent role than the prince in the original film, and it's an interesting switch. I kind of like that they've done that, but again, he's also very bland and very boring. Obviously, there's a whole romance element between him and Snow White, but there's just no chemistry between their characters. And then there's the Seven Dwarfs. They've been the source of so much controversy around this film, and they are just really terrible in this film. They really exemplify one of the biggest issues in transitioning from animation to live action. Because in animation, you can exaggerate facial expressions and movements, you can make them all look really distinct. But because this is live action, they can't do any of that, and it's much, much harder to tell any of them apart. And they also look really weird. There's a real uncanny valley thing with them. You know, it's a big, big problem when like the whole thing with 7 of your major characters is that they're really distinct and have different personalities, and then you can't really tell any of them apart very well. And it's in those moments that you go, if you're going to do it this way, why have you done it at all? Because it just doesn't work. I felt the same was true with the dress as well. They have her in the iconic yellow and blue dress from the original. And look, that design works in a cartoon, but in live action, it looked so much like a costume. It's one of those things where they've done the costume like that because that's how it was in the original and they have to do it that way, but it didn't feel like it matched any of the other costume design for the rest of the characters. The one thing I did really like about this film was the way it was lit. There are points when the movie does look like CGI sludge, but there are other moments where they do have great big practical sets and they look fantastic. So much of cinematography nowadays leans into grounded, realistic lighting with motivated light sources, but I loved how this movie lent into the fairy tale aspects of it, with light coming from completely unrealistic places, but it just looks fantastic. It's just a shame there's such a mixed bag, because there are points when they're in the castle and it just did look fantastic. But the craziest thing about this movie is, even after all the hullabaloo and all the drama, the movie is just kind of aggressively fine. Like, Snow White as a character doesn't work for me, the Evil Queen doesn't work for me, the dwarves don't work for me, but they all just are kind of serviceable enough to get the job done. And I really keep coming back to that thing where, like, the worst kind of movie isn't a 1 out of 10, it's like a 5 out of 10, because at least a 1 out of 10 has done something so terrible to at least make it interesting, whereas this film is just so bland and nothing that it's even hard to talk about. It's just weird that all like the drama and stuff around the film ends up being kind of more interesting than the movie itself, which is a shame, because I thought there was a lot of opportunity here. I thought Rachel Ziegler was great casting. I thought she was very good in the film despite everything else around it. I just feel kind of bad for every parent that has a Disney Plus subscription that is going to have this on repeat 6 months from now. If you've seen Snow White, let me know what you thought in the comments, and if you want to make sure that you keep up with everything coming up on the channel, make sure to subscribe.